aging is malleable, that your destiny in terms of your health span, so your quality adjusted years of life, is under your control. That this approach to therapeutically target aging makes a lot of sense and is worthy of investment, right? Of our tax dollars going into it, of investment dollars going into it.
Welcome to Tough Tech Today with Mayan and Miller. This is the premier show featuring trailblazers who are building technologies today to solve tomorrow's toughest challenges.
Welcome to Tough Tech Today. There has been evidence that when it comes to mice in the laboratory, putting the blood of young mice into old mice has caused them to grow biologically younger. While the opposite is also true, putting the blood of older mice into younger mice has caused the young ones to grow biologically older. We're here with Dr. Mark Allen, a physician who also co-founded the pharmaceutical company Elevian, to explore the implications of this phenomenon to see is there a way to commercialize therapies for humans experiencing aging-related diseases such as stroke, diabetes, and obesity. We sat down with Mark just ahead of their $40 million Series A funding round in late 2021, and they are now on track to be conducting human trials this year. Mark and his team are using a recombinant growth differentiation factor, which is something that we really want to double-click into what that is. Welcome, Mark. Tell us about Elevian.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Jonathan. Elevian is a biotech company that's working on new medicines that target the aging process. So if you think about this, aging is the number one risk factor for most chronic diseases. And not just chronic diseases, but all forms of debilitation that we don't have even disease labels for, that occurs later in life. And most pharmaceutical products, most medicines, target individual diseases. The problem with that approach is, to the degree that those drugs work, they only work for that disease and not for all the other diseases that catch up to us and attack us as we age. So to put a fine point on that, if we were to eliminate cancer, just eradicate it from this planet, which would be a wonderful thing to do, it would only increase the average lifespan by 2 to 3 years. And it would more than double the incidence of Alzheimer's disease and many other age-related diseases, which would continue to attack us. So an alternative approach is instead to target various aspects of the aging process itself. So the underlying cellular molecular mechanisms that we see occur with aging. And by doing that, we have the potential to treat and prevent many different age-related diseases at the same time. Now, this is not just science fiction. We're doing this in the lab, and we're seeing remarkable results in animal models that we're in the process of bringing to human clinical trials.
Wow. So can you give me an example of like the effects that you're seeing on these animals? Are they actually living longer? Are you seeing a reduction in disease?
So we have all of this research started with my scientific co-founders working at the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. And they discovered this protein called GDF11 that very little was known about this protein at the time of their initial discovery. So it's a circulating factor that is identical across all mammals, and there are orthologs that go back to earlier species. So, really key part of the evolution of life. And this factor, by some measures, decreases in activity with age. And they estimated what it would take to replenish this protein to its youthful levels via daily injections of a recombinantly produced version of the protein. By recombinant, I mean that it's produced using biotechnology. We can dive into that and how that's done. But when they gave daily injections of this protein to aged animals, they were able to effectively rejuvenate those animals. So they seed that the heart, the skeletal muscle, the brain, the metabolism reverts in many ways to a youthful state. This is really exciting. Now, there appear to be many different things that are happening, but we think the most prominent effect is a regeneration of the vasculature, the blood vessels. And some really interesting thing about our blood vessels. We normally think about our veins and our arteries, things that we see and hear about. But the capillaries are much, much longer when you think of the quantity of them. They're everywhere. I mean, and a lot of them are so thin that just single cells flow through them, and they're between like many, many different cells throughout our bodies. And I heard a statistic that if you were to take all of your blood vessels, so all of your arteries, veins, and capillaries, and line them up end to end in a healthy young adult, it would wrap around the earth. One person would wrap around the earth 2.5 times. Now, when you're a middle-aged person, it's about half that.
Mm.
Now you
They
think
just
about that.
collapse and close off, or
Yeah, they start to close off. So, we talk about this a lot in terms of some of the effects to, you see the effects on atherosclerosis, on your arteries themselves, hardening and becoming inflamed and sometimes clotting down. In your veins, sometimes you see these problems. In veins and varicose veins, people talk about pain there. But the microscopic capillaries, as they start to deteriorate, now you're no longer bringing nutrients to much of the tissues of your body. You're no longer taking out waste. And so some of those nutrients are just food to the cells, right? But some of them are also growth factors, healing factors that are flowing through our circulation. So if you think about this, if we were just to, the only effect, right, was just on the vasculature, right? Just that affects the entire body. Right? So what we see quantitatively, this is also published by one of our co-founders, is we've studied the effects of the vasculature our group, most in the brain. And in the brain, it's about a 50% reduction in the quantity of the vasculature in the old animals, the old rodents. And when we give GDF11 for 4 weeks, it restores the vasculature to a youthful state in terms of the quantity of the vasculature. But also we see quality improvement to the vasculature as well. So we see very quickly an improvement in blood flow, initially in neurogenic regions of the brain where new neurons are forming, and then over 4 weeks to the entire brain. Now, that effect, we see a lot of other effects. So we see the activation of stem cells. Okay, so neural stem cells. We see the activation of other stem cells throughout the body as well. So we see in the skeletal muscle, we see a much faster healing response. So you guys know this. When we age, the rate at which we heal goes dramatically down. So you get a cut or a scrape or a muscle injury. Like when we were young, it'd heal in like, a few days. I just had a scrape on my leg. It took like 3 weeks to heal. So when we give GDF11 to these animals, they heal at the same rate as a youthful animal from skeletal muscle damage. So you see these really incredible effects. So now that rejuvenative effect, right? Where you see this broad effects in aged animals. That's really cool and really, really exciting. Long-term potential in humans, but there's no clinical path for that. Okay, you can't just treat aged people. Aging is not recognized as a treatable disease. It's not reimbursable. So instead, we have to look at strategically, how do we get the product to market? And it's by treating one disease at a time and getting approval for one disease. And so strategically, when you think about this, if we were to go after even an aging, let's say a disease prevention type of indication, a clinical trial for that would be really long and really expensive because you'd have to recruit patients that are well into the trial, treat them for some indefinite period of time until they potentially get illness or not. So it would take many, many patients and a long time. So instead, we look at what's the worst possible disease that has a terrible status quo. So basically has no good treatment, and where we could treat for the shortest possible duration to see clinically meaningful effects. And so we looked, when we started working on this, our co-founders had done several studies in different areas, and then based upon their work, other groups started picking this protein up and doing studies in different areas. So we saw there's quite a bit of data already out there, and we really began to analyze this as a commercialization strategy. So what would it take to prove out for a given disease? And the way this works is you first have to prove it out in animals, then but when I say prove it out, you have to prove two things. Number one is efficacy, that it actually works to reverse a disease. Number two is you have to prove safety. Okay, and then you reverse that in humans. So first in humans you prove safety, then you prove efficacy. Okay, so
you've already told me what the secret sauce is. How do you with this particular protein, how do you protect your invention?
because I mentioned so little was known about this protein at the time of our co-founders' discoveries, that they patented with Harvard University and their research collaborators, they patented quite broadly in a couple of different categories. So number one is the use. So you cannot patent a natural protein, right? So you can't patent the protein itself. You can't get a composition of matter patent so that nobody else can study it. But what you can do is you can patent methods of use of the protein. And so they patented methods of use to treat a broad range of different age-related diseases. So diseases of the heart, of the brain, of the skeletal muscle, of the metabolism. Okay, so kind of effectively the most common diseases. So that's one category. And then another category is new compositions that modulate this protein. Okay, so a new composition, a molecule that doesn't exist yet, and a way that you might increase the production of GDF11, increase its activity levels, or keep it from being broken down, pulled out of circulation. So lots of different strategies there. So our first generation as a company, our first generation product is the natural protein. And we're already working on next generations as well, that can, the goal there is, I mean, there is some goal of, extending patent life so that we have that, but the bigger goal is to provide a product that is more convenient and cost effective than the natural protein. So the problem with the natural protein is that a protein has to be injected, right? It's broken down by the gut. So now there are lots of technologies that people are working on to allow us to ingest proteins or take them in different ways, inhale them, transdermal, encapsulate them so that you can take them oral. There's lots of technologies like that, but you don't want to use a new technology at the same time you bring a new molecule into humans. So so that's one way to ultimately get this, but into a more convenient form. Not necessarily, that wouldn't necessarily be cost effective unless you make lots of technology inventions along the way. Which I'm sure we will. But the other is to identify different ways of, like, for example, engineer the protein to make it last longer in circulation, longer half-life, or find another molecule that prevents its breakdown. For example, that's a strategy that we have right now, that have some interesting molecules that fit in that category.
This is a long haul kind of project. I mean, from the original publications back, maybe 2005, with your who would become your co-founders on this kind of project, and publications in like Nature, Science, Cell, publications, or proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and like the list goes on. Like, these are amazing publications, and there's a long trail of that. So
what was the process that then that got you engaged on it, like saying, maybe we're on an inflection point to start to commercialize this, or steer this out of the auspices of, like, say, Harvard labs, to make it its own standalone entity as Elevian?
Yeah, yeah. So great question. So yes, indeed. Um, our Elevian scientific co-founders have been working on this path for a couple of decades, and the seminal discovery of this protein itself. So the first discovery, actually, let me go back, and explain it like this. So we know that our the way our body works changes with age. Okay, very clear to everybody. Our genes don't change with age. Our DNA does not change. Okay, minus very rare cancers. Um, so what changes is the expression of different genes. Okay, and that expression of the different genes, the hypothesis is that that would result in different proteins, or at different levels of different proteins between young and old. And so that was really the core thinking is, there were, back in 2000, one of our co-founders, Professor Amy Wagers, uh, wrote a Nature paper that showed that circulating factors can regulate aging. So they used a model called Parabiosis. These are pretty famous studies now, where they conjoined the circulatory systems of young and old mice. And they left those animals together. So the blood's flowing freely between the two animals for 4 weeks straight. And they found after 4 weeks that the old animals had a biological reversal of aging by many different measures. So kind of like GDF11, I told you. So their hearts, their brains, their skeletal muscle, their metabolism. So it appeared biologically to look as a younger state. And interestingly, the young animals exposed to old blood had an accelerated aging by many measures. So, this implicates circulating factors that are sending messages back and forth. So they then went on a hunt. So Amy Wagers got a professorship at Harvard, and working at the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. And she continued this research and asking the question, how do circulating factors change with age, by trying to measure their concentration levels. And so it's really interesting. They say that there's some 20,000 different proteins that we have. And a lot of those proteins, most of them, we still have no idea what their function is. This is really, really interesting. Much, much more that we don't know than that we know. So what scientists have done is and most of these, by the way, we haven't even been able to measure them until recently. They circulate in such minute concentrations. We just didn't have the technology. So they used the latest technologies that were available, and a new technology that was available to measure proteins at levels that we could never measure before. And they identified out of that work a few different proteins that change with age, and one of them being GDF11. And we know in that work that it's actually measuring a combination of a couple of different proteins, GDF11 and a closely related protein called GDF8, that circulates in much higher concentration than GDF11. And so when they looked at this data, there was, as I mentioned, very little known. What was known was what happens if you knock out these proteins in the embryos of mice. And so, people talk a lot about this CRISPR gene editing technology, and it's a new, easier to use gene editing technology, but we've had gene editing technologies for a long time, and a little bit more crude. And so what scientists have been doing is they've been saying, okay, this protein is the same between humans. It's in humans. And by the way, we've been sequencing genes for a long time, and sequencing RNA even before we were sequencing DNA. And so they say, okay, we don't exactly know what this is, but we've identified this particular gene And it's the same or similar in mouse. In the case of GDF11, it's the same in the mature domain of the protein. And so let's knock it out in the embryo of a mouse and see what happens to the mouse. Okay, so they did this with both GDF8 and GDF11. They're so, from a protein biochemistry perspective, these two proteins are in a category of proteins called TGF-beta, super family of proteins, they call it, that have to do with growth and differentiation. So I know they're critical for those purposes.
So these like the GDF11 and GDF8, they're like sort of sibling proteins. It's so far they're sort of showing up in at levels that seem to suggest that they somehow have something to do with the aging process or a lack of aging process, right?
GDF11 much more with many different things. GDF8 seems to be specific to muscle. So let me explain that.
So they knocked out one or the other.
Out one or the other.
And that's how
so going back, this is 20 years ago now. So scientists knocked out GDF8, and the animals make it to term they're viable and they're hypermuscular. So it's the mighty mouse.
That means the animals are alive. They're
alive,
but
they appear to have normal phenotypes. Yeah, when we say phenotype, that means kind of everything about the body, how it looks, what it looks like molecularly, but it's hypermuscular. And you've seen humans that are just naturally muscular. So a lot of those humans have variants of GDF8, okay, that produces less GDF8. And they've created horses, they've created cows, they've created dogs with GDF8 knockouts, and they're hypermuscular. So as a result of those studies, a number of different pharma companies started to work on creating drugs that would knock down GDF8 to treat various muscle diseases. Right, makes sense. So muscle grows when you have no GDF8. If we knock it down, maybe it will help a muscle disease. So the GDF11 shares 90% amino acid sequence homology to GDF8. So very, very close. But has very different behavior in embryonic knockout, and now we know also in post-birth. So when you knock out GDF11, by contrast, the animal makes it to term but dies upon birth with malformed kidney, spleen, pancreas, vertebra, retina. So it's essential for life. Now, before these studies, you think, oh, maybe they're similar to the same protein, but clearly they're very, very different. And GDF11 circulates in about 20 times lower concentration than GDF8. So really interesting data there. So that was basically what was known. And so then they do this study. They find that at that time they thought it was just GDF11, but now we know it's some combination of these proteins goes down with age. And when they replenished it via daily injections, it basically reproduced the Parabiosis model that used young blood to rejuvenate the aged animals. You saw very similar effects when you use just GDF11. Now, this is remarkable because in our blood, circulating in our blood, are hundreds, potentially more than thousands, low thousands of different proteins. And one protein can produce this regenerative effects of young blood. That's like really, really incredible.
Is that also, that's then in some ways sort of corroborates what the studies, I think like circa 2014, where it was Alzheimer's patients would be receiving plasma infusions from young, like 18-year-old patients, and seeing if that would help to halt or reverse the Alzheimer's development, right? Is that sort of like the idea?
So one approach to those parabiosis experiments is to say, one approach that we took is to say, what are the proteins that are causing this effect? And let's create a drug or drugs out of those proteins, right? Another approach is to say, let's just take young blood and let's use young blood as the therapeutic, right?
So are Silicon Valley tech giants really harvesting the blood of kids
QAnon.
Yeah.
to take
So
injections?
there
Well, it sounds like there's some science
is some
behind
science
it,
behind it, but let's put this into perspective. There are people working on this too. And there's some very credible science and there's some non-credible science. Let me say that. So the concept to let's go to a clinic and let's inject ourselves with, let's get some blood transfusions of young blood. It's a real big stretch based upon the science. So the Parabiosis model, the animals have a continuous transfusion of young blood for 24/7 for 4 weeks, right? So the concept that you could get a few units of blood and reproduce those effects is just not based on science. That's really the issue. Now,
So that
perhaps
if I'm in an accident or something like a car accident and need some blood that from the folks who have donated, I shouldn't be worried that I should be worried about my life and being patched up, not so much whether I'm getting blood from an 18-year-old or a 70-year-old. That in the scheme of things, it's such a minute amount that it doesn't matter.
The factors that you need, right? The red blood cells that you need that are lost. And the plasma that you need, it doesn't matter if it comes from a young or an old. So there are these factors that circulate in much, much lower concentration. So if you were to take, for example, GDF11 and you were to try to extract it from the blood, it circulates in such minute concentrations that you'd hardly get any. So it's just not an effective way. So before we had this recombinant technology to manufacture proteins, we used to extract proteins from the blood of animals. So the first treatments for diabetics, insulin, was we would extract the insulin from pigs. So it'd take 6 pigs, you'd have to kill them and extract their blood to treat one diabetic patient for a year. So it's not an effective way. So the whole industry of biotech was created around this concept of recombinant protein manufacture. So we identify what the gene is of the protein that we want. We insert that gene into a virus. We then transfect is called a cell. So the virus comes in and inserts its gene into the DNA of the cell. And now that cell starts to manufacture the protein. And we use cells that are immortal, that can continue to divide forever. So sometimes use a bacterial cell, or in our case, we use, it's called a CHO cell, which stands for Chinese hamster ovary. That's kind of funny, not? So CHO cell, we use a CHO cell, we insert a whole bunch of copies of the gene into the cell, and then we grow the cell in big vats with media, so a liquid that feeds the cell, and the cells start making the protein and excrete it out into the liquid, and then we pull the liquid off and we purify it and we pull the protein out of the liquid. That's the process for manufacturing. So that created this whole industry of biotech, and it's now being used for many, many, many different purposes. But the first companies like Genentech and Amgen that started using this for things like insulin initially, a growth hormone, and other factors. So we're doing the same thing with our protein.
It's pretty wild. I recall hearing about, with, like, say, horseshoe crabs as being sort of with their blood is a weird blue color, and it has I think it has a recombinant factor in it that makes it really great for sort of, it's antibacterial, and there's a rapid healing. And so that sounds like, then, to me, I'm not an expert, of course, on recombinant growth factors, that these kinds of proteins are potentially sort of unlocking a lot of this kind of healing, or in some ways superhuman kind of abilities, where extramuscular or or able to withstand the aging process in a perhaps more graceful way, though perhaps unnatural way. Is that
Yeah,
approximately
well,
correct?
so that's certainly our hypothesis, right?
Okay.
And a hypothesis that we created the company from. And we just need to prove that out and prove that all of these incredible effects we're seeing in animals translate to humans. Now, there's no question that proteins can make really excellent therapeutics. There's tons of proteins that, as a category, I've heard it's actually more revenue than any other modality of drugs, than any even small molecules, which is what become pills, oral pills. So, in examples are insulin, growth hormone, as I said, but there's epogen, which stimulates growth of red blood cells. There's things that stimulate growth of platelets. There's albumin. There's many different recombinant proteins that are out on the market. So it's a very proven modality, and it's a modality that, if you make a high quality manufacturing where it is effectively identical to the protein in humans, then because the body's already seen it, it's more likely to be safe. Now, certainly if you put too much of anything, including oxygen or water, you're going to start to see toxic effects. We see the same thing with GDF11. If we put too much of anything is not good. But at the right range, we're seeing these therapeutic benefits and safe. So I wanted to go back. I realized I didn't answer your question about, like, how did this whole thing come to be? And so kind of two ways. So I talked about our co-founders and their path in coming to understand and learn about this, and then publish it. And so my path, I'm trained as a medical doctor. Prior to that, as in applied physics, and I then so being a medical doctor, it's a noble profession. You're helping people. That's what it's about. But it's also a frustrating profession because there's no scale, there's no leverage to it. To me, you can only help people one at a time while you're working. So I always looked at this as, how can I scale? How can I help many more people? And even when I'm gone, and it's by creating some product, right? And so while I was going through my medical training, I created one of the first web-based expert systems to help doctors diagnose and treat patients better using basically the world's best knowledge. And I left halfway through my residency, which was in emergency medicine, to start this company called Corticon to create this product. And so I ran that company for 12 years, had a successful exit with that. And then after the exit, I left with, I guess, enough money to really step back and think about what I wanted to do next, and went right back to that same question. How do I help people at scale? And it's where I started. One of the very first things I did when I stepped back was I took the digital curriculum from Peter Diamandis and Singularity University around exponential thinking. And it's really interesting. It's now part of something that's called Abundance 360 Digital, this curriculum. And
I smile because he was a graduate of my lab at MIT. One of our famous
another
graduates.
reformed physician, medical doctor that's doing other things. Really phenomenal guy. So Peter and we created this postgraduate university, Singularity University, that teaches exponential thinking. And so what exponential thinking is it's using exponentially improving technologies to solve different problems. And so what's the first exponentially improving technology is computer chips, semiconductors. So semiconductors, and we think of it as Moore's law. are improving in price performance, doubling every year. And you think about the difference between doubling of, if you take 10 steps, you move 10 steps forward. If you take 10 exponential steps, you move 1,000 steps forward. Now, move that to 20, it's 1,000,000. Move that to 30, it's 1,000,000,000. So it's really a whole different way of thinking. And our brains don't think exponentially, but if you start to think exponentially and you get on the ride of exponentially improving technologies, all of a sudden, problems that for all of humanity, we couldn't even maybe, we can imagine solving, I should say, in science fiction, but all of a sudden they become solvable. And they talked about in that curriculum, one of the problems being aging, longevity. And, as a medical doctor, I had never thought about that. It's not the way that they talk about it at all. They, talk about it as a natural phenomenon. There's these different diseases that you would target, but the concept of targeting the aging process, like, oh my God, that's what I want to do. And so right at that time, so this is 2016, not that long ago, these reports out of academic labs were starting to come out where we are scientists successfully extending the healthy lifespan of model species by, in the case of worms, it's 10 times the natural lifespan of worms by one gene change and caloric restriction, 10 times their natural lifespan. And a very similar changes in mice, 2 times their natural lifespan. Now, mice and us share 98% similar genes. Like, it's remarkable. So you think about that, and if we can translate that to humans, wow, right? It changes humanity. And so I immediately, when I read about this, like, this is what I want to do. I announced it to my network and just started getting introduced to people, and just went back to like reading, just picked up every single journal article that I could, and I hadn't read a journal article in a while, so like getting back into that kind of scientific analysis, and then going to conferences, meeting the scientists, and then I met other entrepreneurs interested in the space, other investors interested in the space, and just started looking at different projects. And with my medical degree and my success as an entrepreneur, I got introduced to a bunch of people, and so I looked at a lot of things. And I looked at this from 2 different perspectives initially. I was like, well, first of all, the concept that I really want to get across to this audience is aging is malleable. Okay, there's no question about it. Not chronological age. You cannot do anything about that number, right? But your biological age is absolutely malleable, right? There are things that you can do that accelerate your biological age, like smoking, like being sedentary, right? Like eating a bunch of sugar or overeating. And there are things that can actually reverse your biological age, right? Actually improve it. And so this is, exercise, mindset, proper nutrition, getting sleep. Okay, so really, really important. And so
that's the
concept,
the low hanging fruit for me, and it's I guess I don't know if it may be conventional wisdom, maybe not conventionally applied well, but that, and then
exactly
that if we do that, we get like, I don't know, 80% of the way or something, and then it's this long tail of some really far out ideas like what Elevian's working on that could provide the a bit of a sort of a boo-boo repair if we weren't leading such the healthy lifestyle, or if we really wanted to just keep it going longer and having that quality of life.
Yes,
that's what Elevian could support.
Absolutely. Okay. So I'm convinced. So looking at just the lifestyle interventions, I would like to work with somebody who'd be interested in doing this analysis. But I'm pretty convinced that there is more benefit in quality adjusted years of life if we just did that, certainly in the United States, than probably the entire healthcare system, which, by the way, that's a misnomer. It's not a healthcare system. It's a sick care system. You go and use it when you're sick. Right? So there is like vaccines and stuff that there is some preventative, but it's much more of the spending and the use has to do associated with sickness. So that's kind of number one. But you're absolutely right, Jonathan, is that if you were to do all of that right, there still seems to be some natural cutoff that everybody dies by 120 if you did everything right. Right? It's just the species. And but if you did everything right, probably what would happen is you wouldn't get sick, and all of a sudden you just die.
Mm.
Right?
So then, does that mean that treatments, or I guess we'll call it treatment, like Elevian and there are a lot sort of other companies, other technological approaches that are working on this?
Yeah.
Is there the risk then that this becomes something that's only accessible to kind of the rich who are sort of so focused on staying alive, and they have the means to do that? Or is there another way, that like a reimbursement model that makes it differently than that?
So we're very focused on making this reimbursable, right, for specific diseases. So I'll share that approach, and then I'll come back to this question. So our approach, as I said at the beginning, is to find a disease that we could treat that is reimbursable if it had a good treatment, right? And sometimes the easiest thing is to find something that already has a reimbursable code, and then you just make it better, right? So what we did, and there's a whole bunch of choices. If you look at all the organs that I mentioned, the effects, and there are more, like it has a positive effects on the lungs, for example, on the kidneys, on the liver. When you take a look at that, and we did from different perspectives. So from that perspective of, is it going to be reimbursable? What does the commercial opportunity look like? Are there great drugs that work super well? Well, we wouldn't want to try to go there initially. So by looking at that, we identified this area of stroke as a really compelling first application. So stroke is, across the globe, the number 2 cause of death and the number 1 cause of long-term disability. So stroke, there are 2 types of stroke. There's clots, which we call ischemic strokes, and bleeds, which we call hemorrhagic strokes. And you can't tell the difference between these two from the clinical presentation. So both, you see facial drooping, sometimes hemiparalysis of the body, sometimes difficulty speaking, and the only treatment, is for clots, and it's to break down the clots, and it has to be given within the first few hours. And if you give that treatment to somebody who's had a bleed, you could cause them to bleed more and kill them. So you have to rush the patient to the hospital, get imaging of the brain to differentiate what type it is, and then if it's a clot, you give them the clot busting treatment. So because of that time window, only in the best hospitals in the cities in the United States, only about 20% of patients get that treatment, and about half of them don't see any improvement. Now, half of them see this miraculous improvement. You're paralyzed, and then all of a sudden you're not, because we open up that flow before the cells die. Okay, but most of stroke patients, the bleed patients and the clot patients, have that permanent brain death. It's an infarct to the brain. Now, after that initial period, there is no treatment, right? There's rehab. Now, what's interesting, though, is there is some degree of spontaneous recovery. So some patients seem to recover, but they still have that infarct in their brain. They still have dead cells. So there's plasticity in the brain. There's ability to relearn, right? And throughout our lives, we know this. You can learn new things. That's plasticity of your brain, right? So what GDF11 appears to do, when we give this to animals that have had a stroke, for only a few days we give them this, it significantly improves their ability to recover. So the animals we see, and we're looking at motor function animals. We can't, harder to measure other things. If we look at motor function, so the animals are basically half paralyzed when we give them the stroke. There's a small degree, just like in humans, of recovery, okay, in the natural animals when we give them vehicle. So we still inject them, but without the drug in the liquid. And then we give them drug, and it's a massively improved recovery. And in some cases, you can't even differentiate from normal function. So we see this very fast within 2 weeks in these animals. We repeated these studies, and study after study, we see a really good news is what you don't want is there's only this one magical dose for this, and it only works there. We see it across a broad range of doses. We see it starting at different time windows, right? And we see it in both ischemic stroke clots and bleeds, because it's not working on breaking down the clot. It's working on improving the vasculature. So it's working on helping the brain grow new vasculature to effectively heal itself.
So that's like making the vasculature that was only like wrapping around the earth once, we're making it starting to wrap around the earth more times, going back to that earlier analogy about how much we have. Okay.
You got it. Exactly.
So this is, it's super awesome and like reassuring that we're seeing this in the mice model. But then, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot, is okay, when might we be able to see this being demonstrated in human? And then the bigger kind of question is, when might this be more widely available for folks? Is this something that could be a treatment for my mother or for me, or do I have to wait till like my kids are of age before this would be a treatment modality?
That's a great question, but I want to answer your prior question first, which is, so if this translates, right, the effects that we see in animals, if these translate into humans, this would clearly be reimbursable. Every person who's had a stroke would get this covered by insurance, right? Okay. So now, how do you get it there? So what are the steps from where we are? How long is it going to take? Now, unfortunately, it is a long and expensive process, right, to get through clinical trials. So the clinical trials themselves are, if we're lucky and do everything as well as we can, about 6 years long, more likely 8 years, possibly 10 years. And we're still about 1.5 years from starting our first clinical trial. So right now, our steps as a company, so I mentioned we developed this manufacturing process to make the protein. We need to scale that. We're now making the protein at research scale at our lab and our bench, right?
So like the artisanal
manufacturer.
Of it, yeah.
You got it. It's like a home brew.
Yeah. Okay.
So we need to move that to big commercial scale and in an audited process, right? And then we take that drug and we have to repeat our safety studies with that drug, and then we can go into humans. So those are the steps that we're in the process of doing right now.
I want to go back to kind of your life experiences just real quick, because we've had 3 biotech startup CEOs. 3 of them actually had a successful exit in a different industry before getting tired of spending their time on a beach and deciding, all right, we need to go do the next big thing and change the world. So it's interesting that your story was, somewhat along those lines. I mean, when you had your first exit, did you plan on an early retirement and get restless, or did you always knew you were just waiting for the next thing?
I don't think that I'm ever gonna like retire and sit on a beach. I can't sit on a beach. Like, I go to a beach and I go kiteboarding. I swimming in a beach. Now I do like to enjoy myself, right? So I like to have the work-life balance. So even now today, like when I ran my first startup at the beginning, I was just working. Like I was trained from being the training you have as a doctor. You're working. So a lot of times you don't sleep at night. You just work all night long. And I started to put my software team to that pace, and they were like, Mark, you're going to kill us. I mean, we could do this maybe every once in a while as a sprint, but we can't live like this. I'm like, you're right. But I still kind of drove myself like that. But so after I sold my company, then I sold it and I worked for the acquirer for a little bit. And now I had a work-life balance. Um, and so I kind of learned that. And I'm like, you know what? Anything I do, I'm going to have a good work-life balance. I'm going to work hard, but I'm not going to work 100 hours, right? I'll work 60 hours, right? And then also I want to incorporate, like, the other thing for me is what it's not like life in harmony, life in flow is when you can't differentiate your work from your play. You get so much pleasure out of your work, right? You can't differentiate. I love what I do. I love learning about what I do, right? Working with our scientists. Now, the actual lab work, there's a certain people that are super good at that, and I'm not. I recognize I'm not. I don't have the patience for that itself. But I love to think about the experimental designs. I love to talk about the results and like, oh wow, that's interesting, and just follow the science. And I love to think about the commercial path. I love to think about, how do I translate all this incredible science in a way that investors can understand, in a way that the public can understand, and strategy. How do you build a business? All this stuff I love doing. Like it's as cool to me as going kiteboarding, like to do this stuff, right? So that's really key, and I expect to continue to do that forever. Right? I never want to be not doing that.
Awesome. So once you solved aging, what do you think is going to be your next challenge?
Oh, I think that the solving aging is a long-term challenge. So I don't think we're going to get there overnight with a silver bullet. So I do think, like, all the evidence is from our initial hypothesis that GDF11 plays this important role in the aging process. Like, we are ticking off the risk. We are validating this hypothesis, and coming up with the right ways to bring this to market, and getting investor support. So we're making that work, like, and it didn't have to work like as it's working today. So it's really, really cool that it is. But even we get GDF11 to the market and we start to even use it to prevent disease, nobody thinks that this one protein replenishing it is going to make us live forever, right? So I don't think that it's a silver bullet like that. So I think that you will continue to work on ways to tick away. It's like cancer, right? We've been working on cancer and had a huge push of money and spending from the time of Nixon initially started, right? And now we're at a point where we have really effective treatments for a number of different types of cancers, but we haven't eradicated it from the planet yet. Ultimately, we will, right? I think we will. But it just takes a long time. Now, we need to have that same push on aging, right? And this approach of aging, instead of, like, the NIH has this all wrong. The NIH has all this money going toward Alzheimer's. So they have a National Institute of Aging, and guess where like 80-90% of the money goes? Alzheimer's, right? It's possible. It's possible that Alzheimer's
It's already too late, right?
Exactly.
Not too late, but
billions and billions have been spent and nothing's worked. It's possible that
prevent getting to that point.
So, that instead going after, I really hope that they start to shift their spending toward companies like Elevian and approaches like, not just companies, but approaches that target more generally the aging process and can prevent Alzheimer's and many other different diseases. And so, like, GDF11 itself, studies show, we've done some studies and we show some effects in Alzheimer's, and there are other people that have published some results. But we're not going there. It's because, again, I think it may be intractable.
And for all our listeners and viewers who are like, well, I heard about, like, the anti-aging, age-defying creams and lotions have been around forever. Like, why don't I just lather that on? I see Jennifer Aniston's always like promoting her creams and things. So this is really something that's important to disambiguate, is that it's well, one, the skin's an organ, and there are lotions and creams and things that help make that look less like a crocodile. But that with what Elevian and its sort of a cohort of approaches are going for is sort of from the inside out, that it's going to be able to help make you have not just look like you have like, I don't know, shiny smooth skin or whatever you want, but being able to really feel like you're as you are in your brain. Like where I hear people who are getting up into more senior years who are saying like I feel like my mentally I'm like 30 like I've always been, but my body just feels like it's not keeping up. And so Elevian would be able to help with that, right? To move that goalpost a little bit farther out in a good way.
That's right. That's right. So
Okay.
the term anti-aging is typically applied to that industry that is targeting your skin. Most of them not being a part of the medical industry. You buy a lot of that over the counter, and it works, right? It takes out wrinkles, makes your skin look better, but it's only your skin. The rest of your body and your internals continue to age. Now, GDF11, interestingly, also works on your skin. So
Hmm.
Avon did a collaboration with one of our scientific co-founders, Lee Rubin, and published this and showed that GDF11 injected systemically has about the equivalent effect on the skin as the best skin products, the best positive control out there, we say, which is the best existing gold standard product. So really pretty incredible. That's a nice little side effect. We're not going after, since there's good skin products, we're not trying to come up with a pharmaceutical product that requires prescription that would inject and affect your skin. But it's a nice, as we say, an off-target effect. If you treat stroke and your skin looks better, that's not too bad.
One sort of like 5-year-old kind of question is we mentioned like GDF11, GDF8, and what does this look like? 'Cause I'm kind of picturing like a primordial goo that's in a petri dish, and that's what we want to like inject. What does this look like at the bench when you're making it?
Well, you can't see it. It's a teeny little protein. You can see it when it aggregates together. So if you put it in too high of pH, then it starts to clump up together, and you can see it as cloudiness. But part of the trick of you formulate it in such a way that it doesn't clump up. That's part of the technology and part of the IP that we've created.
So it's kind of like a sea monkey.
Yeah. Now, what you do see is to see things that are molecular level, what we do is we tag them in such a way that we can then read them. So we tag them in some way with fluorescent signaling a lot of times. So we have we develop these bioactivity assays where we give GDF11 and we see when it binds receptor because it turns on this fluorescent tag, and then we can measure the light emitted, right? So that's part of our quality control of the protein, is to see if the cell actually turns on that light. That approach of lighting things up with fluorescence is a very common approach to measure. You have to build those assays, right? But it's a very common approach of how you measure things that are microscopic.
But we also might have some collaborations, future collaborations between some of our tough tech teams. So we have Nautilus Biotech that is doing proteomics. So they've got a device and some AI techniques to actually dig into the structure of different proteins. And we recently talked to New Equilibrium Bioscience, and they're doing a lot of modeling and AI to kind of investigate different proteins that could be useful. So maybe we'll everyone will get linked up and help each other out. It's a fascinating industry.
We have a ton of collaborators, and we're looking for more collaborators. And now we're starting to manufacture a surplus of this protein, which is really expensive. So before we started to manufacture, you could buy it from research suppliers that are making every protein known to man, but it's super expensive. And so it prohibits people from studying, just the expense of that. And so now we're making a lot. And so we're looking for collaborators. You want to study it, and you know this particular disease model, you want to study it, and we can partner up together and look at different diseases. So, really, just excited to share and explore and collaborate.
And I think that brings us to the time on the episode. We did want to give you, one last opportunity to give words of advice or, pitch anything for your company. If you're looking for new scientists or something, the time's yours.
Sure. So a couple of messages that I want to convey. I want to come back to this point that aging is malleable, that your destiny in terms of your health span, so your quality adjusted years of life, is under your control, right? You have to do the right things. And it starts with your mindset, I think, is fundamentally the most important thing. So your mindset, your thoughts create emotions, which create these proteins in your body that either can create chronic stress and age you, or create good feelings that can help to heal you. And the right mindset allows you to do the other correct things: exercise, nutrition, go to sleep at the same time, and wake up, have good routines, right? So super important to understand that. And then number two, understanding that aging is malleable, that this approach to therapeutically target aging makes a lot of sense and is worthy of investment, right? Of our tax dollars going into it, of investment dollars going into it. And so it's very expensive to bring a drug to clinic. So we're constantly raising money. So, if you guys are accredited investors, reach out to me. We have a lot of great investors and, supportive, join the ride of the company, be a part of this, understand where it's going. And, that's really the core message that I want to convey. And I want to thank you all very much for your interest in this topic.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Forrest and I would appreciate if you checked out what Dr. Allen and his team are developing. And it would also be great if you liked, subscribed, or left a positive note about Tough Tech Today. Your feedback is important for us. Our next episode is the third in our series on biology. Until next time, stay tough.